police only served a new arrest warrant against Salinas. Last month, a Manila court also ordered the rearrest of communist leaders Benito and Wilma Tiamzon from other charges. Chief Government Negotiator Secretary Silvestre Bello III denies there's a crackdown on communists. He remains hopeful government and the communists can return to the negotiating table.
The possibility of a sanction is there, and I am just waiting for that enabling environment for us to proceed with the peace talk.
Well, it was a hopeful side some 2 years ago. Rebels who were granted temporary freedom able to participate in the peace talks. But with the negotiations formally ending last year, National Democratic Front consultants and communist leaders are being rearrested or ordered rearrested. How will this affect future efforts when it comes to peace negotiations between government and the communist rebels? With us, Ray Casambre, Executive Director of the Philippine Peace Center. He is also a consultant at the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. And we want to hear from you too. What are your thoughts about the arrest of NDFP consultants? What are your thoughts about the possible resumption of peace talks? Tweet us at ANC Alerts or me at Concept KC. To use the hashtag talkback. Ray, nice to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Carmina, for inviting me here.
All right, first of all, yesterday, February 4, was the first anniversary of the first cancellation of the peace talks under the Duterte administration. But by Feb 7 last year, there was already a notice of termination of the talks. But now 2 months since the November 23 termination, no formal issuance of termination yet. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells us that the talks are not technically or officially terminated yet. So the agreements are effective, subsisting, binding and effective on both sides. And even if the talks are terminated, let me say this now, some agreements are not co-terminus with the negotiations. So the negotiations may be terminated, but the agreements still stand.
Well, let's get into that. Chassie, when the arrests or rearrests happened last week, lawyers of those who were rearrested were saying this is in violation of the JASIC. Talking to Secretary Bello, he said, no, that's not in violation because when the president called off the talks, that means everything else on the table.
Well, the problem there with that assertion is that there is an agreement, a written agreement on how to terminate the talks or how to terminate JASIC. And, well, the record speaks for itself. Has the government followed this procedure? Last year, you mentioned that they actually sent a written notice to the NDF terminating the negotiations. Have they done that this year? I don't think so. Ask Secretary Bello, ask Secretary Doresa. They will tell you the truth.
So then we go to the arrests that have been made. One even being called a propaganda stunt by the lawyers, saying that I think it was Romel Salinas who was arrested. Police came out saying that another one has fallen. But then the arrest of Mr. Salinas happened in May.
May. Yes, that's right. He was arrested May 2017, last year. So he has been in detention, and news comes out that he has been arrested, but this time there's a difference. He's now being alleged to be the Secretary General of the CPP, an allegation that was not present before. And now, well, the police are saying, oh no, we did not rearrest him, or they admit that he has not been arrested, but they were just serving a warrant. But you know, that piece of information about his having a higher rank now, and maybe a higher reward, might explain what the confusion is all about.
Well, tell me something, Ray. When the president first terminated the talks and then came out with the declaration that the group is a terrorist organization, how did that affect the group within?
I cannot speak for the group, but as far as I can see, if you look at the documents, the proclamation, uh, it only means that it's a proclamation, but the actual process has to be through what the law says. And the law says that the government has to file an application with a regional trial court, and the regional trial court will have to rule on it to decide whether such organization is really a terrorist organization based on the Human Security Act and on the Prevention of Financial Terrorism Act. If you look at precedents, the Abu Sayyaf was also, an application was filed with a Mindanao court, and it took that court 5 years to decide or to rule on this case. So we don't know. It's something that we cannot really predict. But the thing is, we have to wait. We have to wait and see what the application says. It all depends on what the government alleges.
Marie, I talk to you now and I listen to you now, and I can't help but be reminded of your first meeting with the president. When you first occupied Malacanang, when he was first elected as president, and things were really okay then. In fact,
Very
both
bright.
sides very bright, both sides optimistic that under this administration, peace talks will be successful and will reach its ultimate end. Did anything in that meeting ever give you a clue that this is how it's going to end? If it is the end.
To tell you the truth, no. I was so hopeful then that this time we have a different president. Judging by his words, but of course, as a peace advocate, I could be very optimistic. But as someone who has also gone through martial law and all of these different presidents, I cannot also say that I also had some doubts. So it's good that you mentioned that meeting now, because it really is very relevant. In that meeting, the government panel was there. I was there, Saturo Campo, the legal counsels of the NDF, another consultant, Randall Echaniz. And he was, the government panel was reporting on the releases that they were working on. And at the end of the report, the president asked, meron ba tayong magagawa para mapabilis pa yan at mapadami yung i-release? And so I replied that, Mr. President, as a matter of fact, there are 3 NDF consultants still in detention, and it is only you who can release them because they had been convicted, and they had been convicted unjustly. So there should be no problem. It's a question of justice. They should be immediately released. And you know what his reply was? He said, I know that.
He said that.
He said that. I know that. I know. He knew that he was the only one who could pardon these convicted consultants. And he said, and I am willing to walk the extra mile for peace. And at that point, Saturo Campo explained that, as a matter of fact, aside from these 3 consultants, all the other political prisoners who had been listed, around 400 of them, most if not all of them had been charged with criminal offenses for their political beliefs. That's what makes them a political prisoner. And this is contrary, it's contrary to international law, it's contrary to Philippine law. You have the Hernandez Doctrine. It's contrary to the agreement between the government and the NDF on the respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. Here it says that alleged, what the government calls alleged political offenders, rebels or insurgents and so on who have been captured. And even the police and military describe them as such. And yet they are charged with criminal offenses.
And the president understood this.
The president said, I am going to stop that policy and practice. And he continues, and you know why? Every freshman law student, I cannot forget his words. Every freshman law student knows, hindi mo pwedeng tilarin ang rebellion sa mga maliliit na crimes. And you know why I will stop that practice? Because if I do not, there will never be peace. Because there will always be injustice.
Fast forward to what happened just last week. You had the arrest or re-arrest of Rafael Bailosis, Guillermo Roque, and then last May, Romel Salinas. Mr. Bailosis was arrested because of, possession of firearms. And I was talking to the arresting, at least the head of the arresting unit, and they were saying that they were under surveillance because of suspicious activity. And they only found out the identification of Mr. Bailosis only happened after the arrest.
Before Bailosis, let's go back to that August meeting. Of the 3 consultants who have been convicted, only 1 has been released. The 2 are still there. And since then, people who are suspected of being rebels, connected with the NP, sympathizers or what, are being arrested and charged with murder, arson, criminal offenses. And the favorite of, charge or offense for alleged leaders is illegal possession of explosives.
Because firearms just won't cut it.
Yes, because it's bailable.
That's why they had to add it in the end.
Nakalimutan nila noong una na i-charge si Rafi Bailosis ng illegal possession of explosives. And then they find out, oy, leader pala ito, or alleged leader. So they come up with a grenade and say, it was found in his possession. Now, there are, if you go by the law, there are procedures which have to be followed para naman hindi makapag-plant. You need witnesses. Hindi ba kailangan nandyan yung barangay to attest that these items were really taken from this person being arrested? Without that procedure, how can you prove that these items were taken from these arrested persons? Yung na-convict nasa Muntinlupa ngayon, wala. The court records show that there was no receipt. Pag pinatransfer ng possession yan, nagpipirmahan yan. So there has to be this record of possession.
But there's also another side to this. And government says that as you're talking, as you're there negotiating for peace, something else is happening on the ground. And there is a disconnect as well. It's not just your allegations against the police, the military. It's also the other way around. That the right hand doesn't seem to know what the left hand is doing. We're going to talk about that when we return after this short break. We're going to take a quick break now, talk back on ANC. We'll be right back. Stay with us, please.
There is no disconnect, Carmina. The reason why there are negotiations is because there is armed conflict. The negotiations intend to end the armed conflict permanently. So there has to be talk about the causes of the armed conflict, the roots. There has to be an agreement on how to solve or how to remove those roots of the armed conflict. Now, the wisdom of the GRP-NDF negotiations is that they started with the agreement on respect for human rights and international humanitarian law. Why? Because talking about roots will take a long time. But how do you make the peace negotiations beneficial to the people immediately? By mitigating the effects of war. by having an agreement on respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, by having a monitoring mechanism. That's why they have the JMC. Now, all of this talk about violations, attacks, and so on are normal in war, in armed conflict. And the reason why there is that JMC, Joint Monitoring Committee, is precisely to mitigate that or to address the complaints. Ano ba yung totoo? Kasi syempre, madaming ano yan claims and counterclaims. Now, unfortunately, ang disconnect talaga doon sa compliance. Even with an agreement which you already have, black and white yan eh. Ano yung bawal, ano yung paano dapat irerespeto, no? Yung karapatan. Hindi lamang ng NDF, hindi lamang ng sundalo. Mamamayan yan. Ng mamamayan. Kasi mamamayan ang biktima eh. Di ba? Yun. So I think the most important thing to ask for now, maybe not yet the resumption of the peace talks, kasi medyo malayo pa yan at mahirap, no? But can we not just agree on implementing the agreement on the human rights and international humanitarian law?
Which, by the way, is having its own anniversary come
Yes.
March 3rd.
March 16.
March 16.
March 16 is the 20th anniversary of Karil. And I think it's worth commemorating and celebrating, and most importantly, implementing. The same question we asked the government. We're not getting very forthright answers. But if you ask me personally, this is not an NDF position, it's just my own analysis. I think what changed the government's mind was Marawi.
How so?
They did not expect, the government did not expect the magnitude and the intensity of the fight with the Moro groups. I don't want to label them with anything except to say they were armed groups. And the government was felt or decided, maybe was compelled to resort to greater assistance from the U.S. military or from the U.S. government, which it gave.
In exchange for that terrorist declaration?
I think so, because the foremost entity that was interested in having the CPP-NPA declared a terrorist organization is the U.S. government.